History is a tapestry woven from countless events, yet some threads have been deliberately hidden, erased, or simply forgotten. Among these obscured events, there exists a war so consequential, so transformative, that its consequences still ripple through our world today, yet few have heard of it. We speak of what historians now call the Forgotten War, a conflict whose story was buried beneath the weight of official history, overlooked, ignored, or misrepresented. The roots of this war reach deep into the 19th century, a time when empires expanded, borders shifted, and the ambitions of rulers collided violently. Official textbooks rarely recount its battles, its atrocities, or its political consequences. But the evidence survives, in letters, in obscure military reports, in the fading accounts of witnesses whose lives were shaped forever by these events. Piecing together these fragments reveals a narrative of ambition, betrayal, and human suffering that demands attention. This forgotten conflict was not isolated. Its causes were tangled in global currents of trade, empire, and ideology. It connected distant regions through a chain of political maneuvers that historians often dismiss as minor footnotes, yet, in reality, it influenced the rise and fall of nations, the trajectories of empires, and the lives of millions. The war was brutal, its campaigns marked by both strategic genius and unspeakable cruelty. Yet it remains absent from most mainstream accounts. What follows in this story is an exploration of the battles, strategies, and hidden motivations that defined this war. From the clandestine negotiations in smoke-filled rooms to the rivers of blood that went unrecorded, we will uncover the forgotten truths, exposing a chapter of history deliberately left in the shadows. In 1899, as the world's attention was focused on the rise of modern empires and industrial powers, a war erupted in the islands of the Philippines. A conflict that many history books now reduce to a footnote beneath the Spanish-American War. Yet its impact was profound, reshaping the relationship between the United States and Asia, and leaving scars that would echo for generations. This was the Philippine-American War, a brutal and largely forgotten struggle for sovereignty and identity. After centuries of Spanish colonial rule, Filipinos declared independence in 1898, inspired by nationalist leaders such as Emilio Aguinaldo. They envisioned a free nation, their own republic, finally liberated from foreign domination. But the United States, fresh from its victory over Spain, had different ambitions. Rather than recognize Filipino independence, the US claimed the islands under the Treaty of Paris, setting the stage for a violent confrontation between two forces whose motivations were worlds apart. The conflict that followed was unlike anything the American public expected. What began as a series of conventional battles soon escalated into a guerrilla war of staggering ferocity. Villages were razed, civilians were caught in crossfires, and reports of atrocities, executions, forced relocations, and scorched earth campaigns filled the correspondence of soldiers and journalists alike. Yet these horrors were downplayed, sanitized, or omitted entirely in official records. The Filipino struggle was rendered invisible, a shadow of resistance erased by the tides of the empire. This war was not merely a clash of armies. It was a battle over the very concept of freedom and governance. The Filipinos fought not only against foreign occupation, but for recognition of their right to self-determination. Meanwhile, American policymakers faced an ethical and strategic dilemma, seeking to assert global influence while grappling with the moral consequences of conquest. The war claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and tens of thousands of American soldiers, a staggering toll for a conflict largely hidden from public memory. And yet, the Philippine-American War was only the beginning. Its suppression of independence and the violent methods employed, set a precedent for interventions that would recur throughout the 20th century. The strategies, both military and political, developed in this conflict influenced US foreign policy for decades, shaping wars, occupations, and even the global perception of America's role on the world stage. To fully understand the forgotten war, one must first confront the hidden truths of the Philippine-American struggle, the evidence that history tried to bury. As the world watched the escalating conflict in Vietnam, few realized that a secret war was raging just across the border in Laos. From 1964 to 1973, the United States conducted an extensive covert campaign to counter communist forces, funding local militias, airstrikes, and clandestine operations in a country officially neutral in the eyes of international law. This conflict has often been called the Secret War, a shadow within a larger war, deliberately hidden from public view for decades. The Laotian campaign was largely conducted through proxy forces, including the Hmong tribesmen, who bore the brunt of the fighting. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense jungles, steep mountains, and hidden supply routes, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Pilots flew perilous missions, dropping bombs and supplies with almost no recognition or acknowledgement. The sheer scale of bombing was unprecedented. Laos became the most heavily bombed country per capita in history, yet international awareness remained minimal. Entire communities were displaced or destroyed, and the environmental and human toll was catastrophic. The secrecy surrounding the operations ensured that these events were largely absent from mainstream history for decades. Congressional oversight was limited, media coverage was sparse, and the average American citizen remained unaware that a country had been transformed into a theater of war. Yet the consequences were profound. The strategic decisions made in Laos influenced the course of the Vietnam War, determined supply lines, and shaped US military doctrine for future conflicts. The Secret War also left a lingering legacy of unexploded ordnance, continuing to claim lives long after the ceasefire. Families were fractured, villages abandoned, and generations traumatized. To historians piecing together the larger narrative of 20th century conflicts, Laos represents an overlooked pivot point, a hidden battlefield that shaped not only Southeast Asia, but also the global understanding of modern warfare. Few conflicts rival the Paraguayan War or the War of the Triple Alliance, 1864 to 1870, in terms of sheer devastation relative to the population involved. Paraguay, a landlocked nation in South America, found itself at war with three neighboring powers, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, a coalition formed under political and territorial pretexts. Yet the true scale of the conflict and its long-lasting consequences have been obscured in global history. Paraguay entered the war with a population barely over 500,000, yet it fielded an impressive military force led by the determined President Francisco Solano Lopez. The battles were devastating, employing both conventional and siege tactics, with towns and farmland reduced to ruins. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of Paraguay's male population perished, and the nation's economic and social structures were shattered. Entire generations were lost, altering the demographic and cultural landscape forever. Historians often describe this as the bloodiest conflict in Latin American history, yet international awareness remains limited. European powers, preoccupied with their own interests, offered little intervention or commentary. The post-war reconstruction required decades, and Paraguay emerged profoundly weakened, its ambitions curtailed, its sovereignty constrained by external influence. The Paraguayan War exemplifies how regional conflicts can have outsized consequences on national identity and geopolitical stability, yet remain nearly invisible to global audiences. In the broader tapestry of forgotten wars, Paraguay's tragedy underscores how human ambition and rivalry can destroy civilizations, even in corners of the world far removed from the gaze of historians or the media. Long before empires like Rome or Persia dominated the globe, city-states in ancient Mesopotamia clashed over resources and borders. The Lagash War, which erupted around 2450 BCE, is considered one of the first recorded interstate wars in human history. This conflict over fertile farmland and water rights offers a glimpse into the origins of organized warfare, yet it is rarely taught outside specialized archaeology courses. Clay tablets from Lagash document the hostilities, detailing battles, treaties, and claims of divine support. These ancient scribes described not just military engagements, but also the consequences for civilian populations, including forced relocations and destruction of property. The war illustrates that even in early human societies, control over land and resources could ignite prolonged conflict, shaping political structures for centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that this war influenced the development of codified law, administrative structures, and early propaganda, using recorded victories to legitimize rulers and justify expansion. While the scale may seem small compared to modern conflicts, its significance is enormous. The Lagash War set precedents for diplomacy, military strategy, and the ethical dilemmas of conquest. Yet, because it predates the written accounts of many civilizations, it exists on the fringes of historical awareness. Few realize that humanity's first experiments with warfare, diplomacy, and territorial conquest occurred millennia ago, echoing in patterns we see repeated in modern history. In the early 17th century, the Scandinavian region was convulsed by a conflict largely forgotten outside local archives, the War of the Oaken Crown. Sparked by disputed succession in a minor duchy, this war escalated into a series of campaigns involving Denmark, Sweden, and allied mercenary forces. While minor in comparison to the 30 Years' War, its consequences on trade routes, alliances, and regional politics were profound. The conflict combined conventional battles with guerrilla-style engagements in forests and fjords, leaving entire villages depopulated. Economic disruption forced neighboring states to intervene diplomatically, yet treaties remained fragile, and the war dragged on for nearly a decade. Despite its relatively small scale, historians argue that the War of the Oaken Crown contributed to shifts in power balance in Northern Europe, influencing later Swedish and Danish ambitions in the Baltic. Much like other forgotten wars, the documentation is patchy. Diaries, legal records, and merchant correspondence are the only surviving sources, scattered across archives and seldom referenced in global histories. The lessons of this obscure war about diplomacy, resource scarcity, and the unintended consequences of succession disputes remain surprisingly relevant, highlighting how even localized conflicts can reverberate across centuries. In the early 18th century, Oman became the stage for a largely overlooked struggle over succession and control of trade routes. When Sultan Saif bin Sultan passed away, rival factions within the ruling family ignited what is now called the War of the Omani Succession. While it might seem minor compared to the global conflicts of the era, its repercussions shaped control over the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean. The war was fought on multiple fronts: desert skirmishes over fortresses, maritime engagements in the Gulf of Oman, and clandestine political maneuvering that involved foreign powers, including the British East India Company. Mercenaries, tribal alliances, and rival governors all played a role, turning what might have been a dynastic dispute into a protracted and destabilizing conflict. Cities were besieged, trade caravans intercepted, an entire region suffered famine and displacement. Despite its local importance, this conflict is nearly invisible in mainstream history. Yet the consequences were lasting. Oman's internal stability shifted, foreign influence expanded, and control over strategic maritime routes became a bargaining chip for centuries to come. The War of the Omani Succession reminds us that even seemingly small power struggles can ripple across continents, shaping trade, diplomacy, and regional geopolitics. The early 19th century saw the British Empire expanding relentlessly across Asia, and the First Anglo-Burmese War, 1824 to 1826, stands as a stark example of a brutal conflict that is rarely acknowledged in Western narratives. It began as a border dispute, but escalated into a full-scale invasion, revealing the devastating power asymmetry between a colonial empire and a sovereign kingdom. Burmese forces fought with remarkable resilience against the British, employing both conventional armies and guerrilla tactics in difficult terrain. Yet British military technology, including advanced artillery and naval forces, ultimately overwhelmed local defences. The war's toll was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians perished, and Burma was forced into significant territorial concessions, including the ceding of Assam, Manipur, and Arakan. The war's significance is profound. It marked the beginning of British dominance in Burma, setting the stage for future colonial administration, exploitation of resources, and eventual integration into the British Raj. Yet this pivotal moment is largely absent from global textbooks. It is a forgotten war that reshaped the geopolitics of Southeast Asia, demonstrating how imperial ambitions can permanently alter borders and societies, even in conflicts few remember. During the late 19th century, the southeastern regions of modern-day Nigeria became the scene of persistent resistance against British expansion. The Aro Confederacy, a sophisticated network of trading states and spiritual influence, clashed repeatedly with British forces in what came to be known as the Aro-Anglo conflicts, 1898 to 1901. The British, seeking control over trade routes and access to palm oil and other resources, underestimated the military and political organisation of the Aro people. Ambushes, raids, and battles across dense forests demonstrated that local knowledge and unity could resist a technologically superior empire. However, the eventual British victory dismantled the Aro Confederacy, seized control of key economic regions, and enforced colonial dominance in the area. What is striking is how little this conflict features in historical consciousness outside Nigeria. Tens of thousands were displaced, cultural institutions were suppressed, and local governance structures were replaced with colonial administration. The Aro-Anglo conflicts exemplify a recurring theme in forgotten wars. Indigenous resistance may fail to appear in global narratives, yet its consequences permanently alter societies. In the late 19th century, South America witnessed a series of territorial wars, often overshadowed by global events. Among these, Chile's campaigns against Peru during the War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1884, stand out. While Peru and Bolivia were caught in conflict over mineral-rich regions, Chile's military campaigns decisively reshaped the map of the continent. These battles were intense, involving not only conventional army engagements but also maritime warfare, blockades, and sieges. The civilian toll was high, with towns razed and populations displaced. Yet the story is barely taught outside regional histories. Chile's eventual victory granted it vast territories, including nitrate-rich lands that would fuel its economy for decades. The war also exposed international indifference to smaller-scale conflicts. Global powers monitored events, but rarely intervened, focusing instead on European colonial ambitions. The Chilean-Peruvian conflicts illustrate how regional wars, though obscured in global memory, can have long-lasting economic and political consequences, quietly shaping the destinies of nations. At the turn of the 20th century, German colonial forces waged a brutal campaign against the Herero and Namakwa peoples in present-day Namibia, 1904 to 1908. Often labelled a war, yet remembered today as one of the first genocides of the modern era, this conflict was part of Germany's effort to consolidate colonial control in Africa. Herero and Namakwa communities resisted occupation and land expropriation. German forces, under General Lothar von Trotha, responded with extreme violence, driving survivors into the desert and cutting off access to water. Tens of thousands died of starvation, dehydration, and direct execution. The war was both a military campaign and a deliberate attempt to eradicate opposition, yet for decades it was underrepresented in historical discourse. The legacy of this forgotten war is profound. It shaped colonial policies in Africa, contributed to the ideology that would later fuel 20th century atrocities in Europe, and left scars in the affected communities. Despite its magnitude, it is rarely included in mainstream history, highlighting how even genocidal conflicts can be hidden from collective memory. In 1939, on the eve of World War II, Finland found itself facing the massive forces of the Soviet Union in what became known as the Winter War. While overshadowed by the larger global conflict that followed, this war is remarkable for the courage of a small nation resisting overwhelming odds. Finnish forces, though vastly outnumbered, employed innovative tactics, knowledge of terrain, and a deeply motivated citizen soldier army to repel Soviet advances. Harsh winters, frozen landscapes, and limited resources made conventional warfare nearly impossible, yet the Finns inflicted heavy casualties, delaying Soviet operations and inspiring international admiration. Ultimately, Finland ceded territory under the Moscow Peace Treaty, but its survival as an independent state demonstrated the strategic importance of asymmetric warfare and morale. Despite its significance in military history, the Winter War is often overlooked outside Finland, buried beneath the larger narrative of World War II. Yet for those studying conflict, it offers enduring lessons about resilience, strategy, and the human dimension of war. Before the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, the Korean Peninsula was already a theatre of tension and violence. Between 1945 and 1950, numerous border skirmishes occurred between North and South Korean forces, often involving clandestine operations and incursions along the 38th parallel. These conflicts are rarely remembered, yet they set the stage for one of the most devastating proxy wars of the Cold War era. The skirmishes involved small units, guerrilla tactics, and covert intelligence operations, with civilians frequently caught in the crossfire. Both sides engaged in sabotage, abductions, and psychological warfare, aiming to destabilize the opposing regime. Casualty figures are difficult to verify, but reports indicate significant loss of life and displacement of local populations. The historical significance of these obscure clashes cannot be overstated. They hardened the ideological divide between the North and South, prepared military leadership for full-scale war, and shaped US and Soviet strategies on the peninsula. Despite being largely absent from mainstream histories, these early conflicts were pivotal, illustrating how seemingly minor engagements can escalate into global confrontations. From 1952 to 1960, Kenya experienced a violent and largely suppressed rebellion against British colonial rule, known as the Mau Mau Uprising. This conflict is often glossed over in global narratives, yet it fundamentally transformed Kenyan society and hastened the end of colonial domination in East Africa. The uprising involved secret societies of Kenyan fighters, employing guerrilla tactics in the forests and mountains of the Kikuyu homeland. British forces responded with brutal counterinsurgency measures, mass detentions, forced labour camps, and extrajudicial executions. Thousands of civilians perished or were displaced, and the social fabric of entire regions was irrevocably altered. Despite its significance, much of the uprising was omitted from official British histories for decades, and its victims largely silenced. The Mau Mau uprising demonstrates the complex interplay between local resistance, imperial ambition, and historical memory, a war whose effects shaped the trajectory of African decolonization, but remains largely hidden from global consciousness. From 1932 to 1935, Paraguay and Bolivia fought over the Gran Chaco region in South America, a sparsely populated, semi-arid territory thought to contain valuable oil reserves. Known as the Chaco War, this conflict resulted in staggering casualties for both sides, yet it remains nearly invisible in global historical discourse. The war was fought under extreme environmental conditions, parched landscapes, scarce water sources, and oppressive heat. Soldiers faced disease, starvation, and exhaustion as much as enemy fire. Modern military historians note that logistical innovation, improvisation, and strategic adaptation were crucial in a theatre so hostile to conventional armies. Though Bolivia initially sought control over the Chaco for economic reasons, Paraguay ultimately retained most of the territory. The conflict reshaped national borders, influenced future military doctrine in the region, and left deep scars on national identities. Despite its significance, the Chaco War remains a forgotten conflict, its human cost and strategic lessons largely absent from international awareness. Before Vietnam became synonymous with conflict, the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, unfolded largely in obscurity for the Western public. Vietnamese forces, led by the Viet Minh, fought against French colonial rule in a campaign that combined guerrilla warfare, rural mobilization, and high-stakes political maneuvering. The conflict saw intense fighting in remote villages, strategic ambushes, and large-scale engagements, such as the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Civilians bore the brunt of the fighting, with widespread displacement, famine, and destruction of property. French forces, despite technological superiority, struggled against highly motivated insurgents with local knowledge and widespread support. This war reshaped Southeast Asia. It ended French colonial control, paved the way for the Vietnam War, and set the precedent for Cold War interventions. Yet the First Indochina War is often overshadowed in historical memory, a vital chapter in a sequence of conflicts whose lessons reverberated globally. Between 1920 and 1927, Spanish forces waged war in the Rif region of northern Morocco against the Berber tribes. Known as the Rif War, this conflict is often overlooked in broader histories of Europe and Africa, yet it revealed the challenges of colonial conquest in the 20th century. The Riffian fighters, under Abd el-Krim, employed guerrilla tactics with remarkable effectiveness, inflicting heavy casualties on Spanish and later French forces. Chemical weapons, aerial bombardments, and scorched earth policies were used by colonial powers in an attempt to suppress resistance. Tens of thousands died, and entire communities were displaced. The Rif War is significant not only for its immediate outcomes, but for its influence on global military doctrine, anti-colonial movements, and European politics. Yet it is rarely remembered outside academic circles. Another example of how impactful wars can disappear from collective memory. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, Central Asia became the site of another forgotten war, the Basmachi Revolt, 1916 to 1934. local Muslim populations resisted Soviet control, seeking to preserve autonomy, religion, and traditional governance. The revolt combined conventional and guerrilla tactics, with mountainous terrain and deserts providing cover for insurgents. Soviet forces employed extreme measures, including forced deportations, executions, and scorched earth policies. The conflict devastated local communities, but succeeded in establishing Soviet dominance in the region. Though central to Central Asian history, the Basmachi Revolt is rarely mentioned in broader narratives of 20th century conflicts. Yet it illustrates a recurring theme in forgotten wars: resistance against overwhelming power, suppressed in memory, but crucial in understanding regional history and identity. In the late 19th century, the Congo Basin was the site of brutal conflicts between Arab slave traders and emerging Belgian colonial forces. These wars, sometimes referred to as the Congo-Arab Wars, 1892 to 1894, remain largely absent from global history, yet they had profound effects on the colonization and exploitation of Central Africa. The wars combined commerce, slavery, and militarized competition over territory. Armed groups clashed in dense forests and along river networks, leading to widespread civilian suffering. The eventual victory of Belgian forces facilitated the consolidation of the Congo Free State under King Leopold II, setting the stage for one of history's most infamous colonial regimes. Despite the magnitude of these events, the Congo-Arab Wars are rarely taught or discussed outside specialized scholarship, leaving a gap in understanding how regional power struggles facilitated the expansion of European colonial empires and contributed to mass human suffering. Long before the world's attention turned to global superpowers, the high plateaus of Tibet and the fringes of China were the stage for a series of lesser-known border conflicts. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, skirmishes erupted over territorial claims, trade routes, and influence among local rulers. These conflicts are rarely recorded in mainstream histories, yet they shaped the modern Sino-Tibetan relationship. The terrain was as formidable as the combatants. High-altitude passes, freezing winters, and thin air turned every march and battle into a struggle for survival. Local militias and Tibetan defenders used knowledge of the landscape to counter numerically superior forces, while Chinese troops relied on reinforcements and artillery to assert control. Despite their local significance, these conflicts were overshadowed by imperial wars elsewhere and remain largely absent from textbooks. Yet the unresolved tensions, shifting borders, and suppression of local histories created a foundation of distrust and resistance, echoing into modern geopolitical disputes in the region. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, the East African coast experienced a series of wars involving sultanates, European traders, and pirate factions. Conflicts such as the Omani-Portuguese Wars and the local revolts against Zanzibar's rulers were complex, often involving alliances of convenience, betrayal, and economic warfare. Ships were seized, ports blockaded, and coastal towns burned. Merchants' wealth was both a target and a weapon, while local populations suffered from raids and forced labor. These wars shaped trade dynamics along the Swahili coast and influenced European colonial penetration into Africa. Despite their regional importance, these conflicts remain obscure in global memory. They demonstrate how economic interests, rather than purely ideological or territorial motives, can drive prolonged and devastating wars, a recurring pattern among forgotten conflicts. The Cold War was not fought only in Europe. It played out across dozens of small, often invisible theatres in Africa and Asia. Proxy wars, covert support for insurgencies, and secret operations defined these conflicts, leaving long-term consequences that rarely entered mainstream historical narratives. From Angola to Afghanistan, covert interventions funded by the United States or the Soviet Union destabilized governments, empowered warlords, and shifted regional power balances. Equipment, advisors, and intelligence were sent to influence outcomes while keeping global audiences largely unaware. These silent wars reshaped nations, often leaving them with weak institutions and enduring instability. The Forgotten War, in this sense, is not a single conflict, but a chain of obscured struggles where global ideologies clashed indirectly, leaving profound human and political consequences. In the Balkans during the 1930s, numerous border clashes and paramilitary campaigns occurred between emerging nation-states. These skirmishes, sometimes labelled as local revolts or minor wars, foreshadowed the chaos that would engulf Europe during World War II. Ethnic tensions, unresolved territorial claims, and nationalist fervour fueled sporadic fighting. Small armies, local militias, and foreign advisors were all involved, yet records remain scattered and incomplete. Historians note that these conflicts influenced alliances, military planning, and political narratives leading into the Greater European War. While small in scale compared to the global conflicts to come, these skirmishes illustrate how forgotten wars can sow seeds of much larger catastrophes, shaping the conditions for subsequent historical events. The 20th century Middle East saw countless localized conflicts that rarely appear in global history. From tribal disputes over newly drawn colonial borders to skirmishes over oil-rich regions, these wars were brutal, shaping the political geography and social structures of the modern Middle East. For instance, clashes in Iraq, Iran, and the Arabian Peninsula involved tribal coalitions, colonial powers, and nascent states testing their sovereignty. Civilians often bore the brunt, with villages destroyed and trade routes disrupted. These conflicts laid the groundwork for larger, more recognized wars later in the century, but their stories remain largely untold. Understanding these hidden wars provides context for contemporary tensions, showing how the legacy of obscure conflicts continues to influence borders, governance, and regional rivalries. As we step back from these hidden chapters of history, a pattern emerges. Across continents and centuries, wars have been fought, lives lost, and nations reshaped. Yet many of these events have been deliberately minimized, obscured, or forgotten. From the Lagash War in ancient Mesopotamia to Cold War proxy conflicts in Africa and Asia, these hidden struggles influence diplomacy, military strategy, and national identities in ways that continue to echo today. The Forgotten War is not a single event, but a web of interconnected struggles, each leaving indelible marks on humanity. The consequences of these conflicts, demographic shifts, altered borders, social trauma, and political precedent, remain with us, shaping the modern world in subtle but profound ways. By uncovering these stories, we challenge the selective memory of history and honor those whose lives were affected. These wars may be forgotten in textbooks, but their impact endures, silently influencing the world we inhabit. Remembering them is not just an academic exercise, it is a recognition of the complex, often hidden forces that have shaped human civilization.